Hello everyone, welcome to Advancing Adventism. In this video, we're going to be looking at a really important letter endorsed by Ellen White. And we know that it was endorsed by her because she has a handwritten postscript at the bottom of it. You can see it in the yellow highlight there. She wrote, "I approve of the remarks made in this letter." And then it's signed Ellen G. White. Okay, now this letter was written by one of her sons, William C. White, or you might know him as Willie White. And in this letter, he clarifies two very important issues that a lot of people misunderstand, even some among SDAs. He clarifies what his mother claimed about her inspiration and her writings, such as whether she claimed verbal inspiration and whether her writings should be used as an authority on history. Okay. Now, he also addresses, why this is so important and how that should impact the way we read her writings. And we're going to be looking at all that, as well as something else written by Ellen White, where she's directly addressing the aspect of how divine inspiration works. And we also have some other bits of information to share from some other sources. Now, at the end of this video, we're going to pull all that together and we're going to be discussing some implications that this information raises. So be sure to stay tuned for that. But with that said, let's start by getting the context of the letter. As you can see, this letter was written October 31st, 1912. It was written from Willie White to Stephen Haskell. And in the first paragraph, Willie is just letting Stephen know that he received the letters that Haskell sent to him, regarding the fall of the Turkish Empire and the dates connected with that history. Then Willie says, he and some of the brethren, they'll look it over when they have time and get back with Stephen as soon as they can. And then after some of these preliminary things, most of the letter is taken up with making these clarifications regarding Ellen White's inspiration and her writings. Now, we're not going to be getting into the details of what made it necessary to make this clarification in the first place. The details aren't relevant for the point of this video. Our goal right now is to find out what Ellen White was endorsing by that postscript. I'm sure as SDAs, we'd all like to be sure we're rightly understanding her and her claims. Okay, so let's pick up with the paragraph next to the big yellow arrow, okay? Willie says, "Regarding Mother's writings, she has never wished our brethren to treat them as authority on history." So, right there, that's just such a plain statement, and we know that Ellen White approved of these remarks, so this statement should carry a lot of weight. Like, if you're an SDA and you've ever wondered whether we should use Ellen White's writings to answer historical questions, well, this gives you the answer, okay? No, we shouldn't. But Willie's going to expand on that, and he has a lot of important things to say. So let's continue reading. He goes on to say, "When Great Controversy was first written, she oftentimes gave a partial description of some scene presented to her, and when Sister Davis made inquiry regarding time and place, Mother referred her to what was already written in the books of Elder Smith and in secular histories." Okay, now just real quickly, I'll mention some little details here. Sister Davis, of course, that's Marianne Davis, and she was Ellen White's literary assistant for many years. And then Elder Smith that he's referring to there is a reference to Uriah Smith. So Ellen White actually describes how Marianne Davis would perform her work. You can find this in letter 61A, 1900, and I'll put a link to that in the description. She refers to Marianne Davis as her bookmaker, and Ellen White says that Marianne would gather material for the books from all of Ellen's writings, which was just a huge help to her since it freed Ellen White up to be able to focus more on her writing. And as this was being done, sometimes Marianne Davis would have questions for Ellen White regarding these historical details, like as she's trying to put all this stuff together, okay? And notice that Ellen didn't point Marianne Davis to one of her own books or a letter that, Ellen White had written to somebody. That's not where she sent Marianne Davis to look for the answers to these historical questions. She pointed Marianne Davis to books written by other people well acquainted with history. And the reason Uriah Smith was one of those people is because he was well acquainted with the writings of historians, and some of his books contain historical information, specifically relevant to the things Ellen White would be writing about. So that would have been a very convenient resource for checking on dates and places and that sort of thing. Okay. So that's just a little bit of the background information regarding who he's referring to and what that's about. Okay. Now let's pick up again with it's the word when next to that big yellow highlighter that you see laying on the paper. He continues, when controversy was written, Mother never thought that the readers would take it as an authority on historical dates and use it to settle controversies, and she does not now feel that it ought to be used in that way. Mother regards with the greatest respect those faithful historians who have given their life to the study of the working out in this world's history of God's great plan, and who have found in this study a correspondence of the history with prophecy. Whenever proof has been found that the writers of our Adventist literature had come short of finding the exact truth regarding some detail, she has always taken her position in favor of correcting those things that were clearly found to be errors, and when consulted about the efforts that were being made to revise and correct the good book, Daniel and Revelation, she has always opposed making unnecessary changes and has always favored correcting those things that were plainly shown to be inaccurate. Okay. Now, clearly, Ellen White respected the role of secular historians. She didn't think their work was unimportant or irrelevant. In fact, she regarded the findings of historians so highly that she recommended for SDA literature to be updated to reflect the facts as stated by these historians. And it's about to get even more interesting, as we're about to see. So let's just keep reading here. He says, it seems to me that there is a danger of placing altogether too much stress upon chronology. If it had been essential to the salvation of man that he should have a clear and harmonious understanding of the chronology of the world, the Lord would not have permitted the disagreements and discrepancies which we find in the writings of the Bible historians. And it seems to me that in these last days there ought not to be so much controversy regarding dates. Okay, so let's pause there for just a moment and we'll consider that part about there being disagreements and discrepancies in the writings of the Bible historians. Like, what's he talking about there? Well, one example that's really easy to see has to do with the order of the temptations that Jesus faced when he was in the wilderness, right after his baptism. And these temptations are recorded in Matthew chapter 4 and in Luke chapter 4. But there are some differences. Like in Matthew, the order goes like this. First, it's, hey, turn these stones into bread. Second, Satan takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple at Jerusalem and says, go ahead and jump, an angel will catch you. And third, he takes Jesus to the top of a mountain and tries to get Jesus to worship him in exchange for, rulership over the world, right? So the order in Matthew is bread, temple, mountain. Whereas in Luke, it's ordered differently. It's bread, mountain, then temple. So that's just one example, but it's enough to show what Willie White was talking about here and that he's making a true statement, okay? And as we know, Ellen White agreed with what he said in this letter. Let's just keep all these things in mind. Now, a significant implication of these facts regarding disagreements and discrepancies in the writings of Bible historians has a direct connection to the topic of verbal inspiration. Okay, so just keep that in mind as well. We're going to be getting to that pretty shortly. I just wanted to point that out while we were still here. Okay, all right, now let's continue reading. For myself, I will say this, that the more I study the experience of the Adventist people, the more I feel to honor and praise and magnify the wisdom of the God of heaven, who gave to a plain man like William Miller an understanding of the great truths of the prophecies. It is evident to anyone who will study his chronology, and then you see the handwritten stuff above the line there that says exposition of prophecy. So Willie White's saying here, it is evident to anyone who will study William Miller's exposition of prophecy that while he had the truth regarding the principal features, that he adopted at first many inaccurate and incorrect interpretations regarding details. At first, these were accepted by his associates, but God raised up scholarly men who had enjoyed broader opportunities for study than Miller, and these men, by their study of the prophecies and history, found the truth regarding many points in which Miller's exposition was incorrect. Okay, now let's just briefly address that. I'll just explain a bit of this because it can help to understand inspiration. One of those principal features that William Miller got right was that the 2300-year prophecy of Daniel 8 was about to meet its fulfillment. They knew the prophecy started in 457 BC, and at first the Millerites just calculated it from the year 457 BC without paying attention to when in the year it started, other than they knew to be using the Hebrew calendar. And in the Hebrew calendar, a year begins in the spring of the year, not in the middle of winter. Okay. So they calculated 2300 years from the year 457 BC, which ends about the year 1843. And I say about the year 1843 because, again, in the Hebrew calendar, the year would go from the spring of 1843 to the spring of 1844. Okay. And they didn't have a definite date in mind initially, that came later. Now, as it turned out, there was an inaccuracy in one of the assumptions that they didn't even realize they were making. Since they weren't paying attention to when in the year the prophecy started, they just calculated from the year 457 BC. But it turns out that the prophecy doesn't actually start at the beginning of the year, it starts later in the fall. So when you count forward from the fall of 457 BC by a full 2300 years, that brings you to the fall of the year 1844. Now, I'm not going to go into more of those details in this video. I just thought it might be useful to share a little bit with this, because it not only expands on what Willie White was referring to in this letter, but it also illustrates an important aspect of how truth is progressively revealed. A message can be true, and yet the person delivering the message may not have a perfect knowledge of every detail related to that message. Okay. All right, now let's continue with the letter. He says, one who studies this experience from the standpoint of faith in that great Advent movement as presented in Daniel and Revelation and Great Controversy cannot fail to rejoice in the goodness of God as they see how he brought in truth and light through the study of many men. And it seems to me that we who love the work that was built upon that foundation ought to treat very kindly, very considerately, very reverently the work which God helped Miller to do. It seems to me that there is nothing anyone could do at the present time that would more effectually destroy the confidence of the people in Miller's work and the work of his associates than to speak and write about the matter in the tone and the spirit used by Brother Leon Smith. And now, Leon Smith is Uriah Smith's son. Okay. He says, it seems to me that nothing could be done more effectually to destroy the confidence of the people in that good and glorious movement than to claim perfection for that which we know was not perfect, and thus challenge the criticism of thinking men. Okay, now hopefully everyone would acknowledge that making exaggerated claims about something isn't a good thing to do. It doesn't end up helping, it actually hinders. If you claim something is inerrant or perfect, and someone finds even one minor flaw, something on a secondary point or an incidental issue, they might think that one incidental flaw undermines the whole thing. And Willie White's son, Arthur also expressed this same principle in something he wrote regarding the importance of understanding how inspiration works. I'm just going to briefly share that with you. Here it is. And you can find this on Adventist Digital Library, and there will be a link in the description. At the top there, we see a little bit of the context that this is in. He's mentioning that there are differences in minor points of descriptions of events as recorded by the various writers, and that's various writers of the Bible. Okay. And then if you skip down to the bottom part that I have underlined in red, he says the critic, assuming that inspiration means verbal inspiration and infallibility, takes these points and holds up to ridicule the idea of the Bible being an inspired book. Now, incidentally, the whole article by Arthur White, Willie White's son, this whole article is just something I highly encourage everyone to read. It's very, very good. I came across it while doing some research for something I was looking for while working on this video. Yeah, I really encourage you reading that. I was very pleased to find that. So back to this letter by his dad, Willie White. Okay. Yeah, when it comes to overstating things or making exaggerated claims, yeah, we should be very cautious to not do that. If we do overstate things and someone knows there's a flaw, it would not only discredit us, but it could very well discredit the message in the other person's eyes as well, which is actually what Willie White gets to in the next paragraph. Okay. He says, yeah, we're going to pick up with where he says, I believe Brother Haskell. Okay. We're going to skip that little part. He says, I believe, Brother Haskell, that there is danger of our injuring mother's work by claiming for it more than she claims for it, more than father ever claimed for it, more than Elder Andrews, Wagner, or Smith ever claimed for it. I cannot see the consistency in our putting forth a claim of verbal inspiration when Mother does not make any such claims, and I certainly think we will make a great mistake if we lay aside historical research and endeavor to settle historical questions by the use of Mother's books as an authority when she herself does not wish them to be used in any such way. Okay, so keeping in mind that Ellen endorsed the remarks that Willie made in this letter, what do we learn from that? Well, one thing we learn is that we don't get to just come along and make our own claims about Ellen's inspiration. We have to judge her according to the claims that she herself made. That is, if we care about not injuring her work. Now, another thing that we learn from this is that these other early SDAs who worked closely with Ellen White, men like her husband, James, and J.N. Andrews, J.H. Wagner, and Uriah Smith, these men knew and understood how we should view Ellen White's work and inspiration. So there's going to be doubtless things that we can learn from their writings as well as from hers. And we actually have another video on our channel that covers more of that. You can find a link to it in the description. Now, before we continue with this letter, I just want to make sure that we all understand what the term verbal inspiration refers to. Okay, verbal inspiration is the idea that the specific words used in Scripture were chosen by God. In other words, God didn't just give the prophet an understanding of their message and then the prophet wrote it out using words of their own choosing. Verbal inspiration is the idea that God actually chose every word the prophet used in writing their message. Now, you can think of that in terms of the prophet being a pen or pencil or whatever in God's hand, God being the writer and using the human as nothing more than a pen. In other words, the human doesn't determine which words to use, just like a pen doesn't determine which words to use, okay? Now, that view, verbal inspiration, that view makes every word written in Scripture to be completely authoritative, completely inerrant. And again, not just inerrant with respect to the message being given, but inerrant with respect to every single detail, whether it has to do with the main point or it's just an incidental statement made in service of communicating the main point. And as Willie White points out, Ellen never claimed that. She never claimed verbal inspiration. But not only did she not claim it for herself, she didn't claim verbal inspiration for the writings of the Bible either. The following statement from her makes this very, very plain. This is taken from one of her manuscripts, Manuscript 24, 1886, and we're only going to read a few snippets from it right now, but I definitely recommend reading the full thing. So I'm going to have a link for you in the description so that you can easily find it online. Or if you happen to have Selected Messages books at home, as you see from the top line there, this entire manuscript is also published in Selected Messages Volume 1. So if you happen to have that book at home, you can find it on pages 19 to 21. Okay, here's some of what she wrote. The Bible is written by inspired men, but it is not God's mode of thought and expression. It is that of humanity. God as a writer is not represented. The writers of the Bible were God's penmen, not his pen. look at the different writers. It is not the words of the Bible that are inspired, but the men that were inspired. Inspiration acts not on the man's words or his expressions, but on the man himself. Okay, now that's how Ellen White understood inspiration to work. And of course, as we've seen, Willie White and his son Arthur White also shared that view of inspiration. And actually, this is pretty generally held by Seventh day Adventists. Here we see in this 1996 SDA encyclopedia a statement that makes this point very plain under the heading Inspiration of Scripture. And the part that I actually want to read is just printed so far apart that it's hard to make it big enough without doing this. Okay, so I just duplicated the right column and then brought it in at the bottom. So we can read those side by side. So as you can see, it says, SDAs do not believe in verbal inspiration according to the usual meaning of the term, but in what may properly be called thought inspiration. Okay, and then it goes on to point to the very quote from Ellen White that we just read. Okay, and in that quote, Ellen White explains that it's not the words that are inspired, it's the person who is inspired. And notice her distinction between being God's penman rather than being his pen. If a prophet were to be just like a pen in God's hand, then that would actually make God the penman. Whoever's holding the pen is the penman, right? But notice Ellen says it's the human who is the penman. She says God as a writer is not represented. Inspiration works by God teaching a prophet certain things, giving them an understanding of certain truths that are relevant for the present needs of his people. And then the prophet conveys those truths to God's people using words and expressions of their own choosing. Now, unless, of course, the prophet is actually quoting something that was spoken to them. Now, you may be familiar with this next statement from Ellen White because she addresses that very thing there. She says, although I am as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in writing my views as I am in receiving them, yet the words I employ in describing what I've seen are my own, unless they be spoken to me by an angel, which I always enclose in marks of quotation. And of course, when she says my views, she doesn't mean uninspired opinions. And that's made pretty plain by the fact that she says she got her views from God in the first place. So, yeah, she's saying she's the one choosing which words to use. And further down, she even says that she was left to describe things in her own language the best she could. So, if we care to not injure a prophet's work, we need to be judging them according to the claims they make about themselves, and we need to not claim for them more than they claimed for themselves. Okay? And as we've seen in no uncertain terms, Ellen White didn't claim verbal inspiration, and she didn't claim to be an authority on history. These are things we need to keep in mind when we're reading her writings. As Willie White says, it would be inconsistent for anyone who believes Ellen was a true prophet to claim she was verbally inspired. Because think about it. If you claim she was verbally inspired while she says she wasn't verbally inspired, you end up with a self-refuting position. You would be obliged by your own claim to believe every word she says, but then the actual words she says would oblige you to reject your claim. See the problem? Yeah, it's a very inconsistent view to hold in light of all the facts. Now, if you've been used to thinking of Ellen White's writings as being word for word, chosen by God, and that they convey exactly the right information on even minor details that don't impact her actual point, then for her to say that her writings shouldn't be used as an authority on history and for her to endorse an understanding of inspiration that allows for mistakes on minor points, you might be tempted to feel like everything's just like all thrown up in the air, right? Like if you can't absolutely consider that everything she said is exactly right in every regard, then is it all just totally questionable or just, like unreliable or whatever? And the answer to that is absolutely not. And something that's super helpful in knowing why this doesn't make her teachings unreliable or untrustworthy is to recognize that there's a distinction between the message Ellen White was conveying and any incidental statements that she made as part of her communication. Incidental statements are statements made in connection with what someone's saying, but they aren't the main point being addressed. And while Ellen White didn't regard herself and her writings as being free from error when it comes to incidental statements, she absolutely did advocate the idea that the message God had given her to bear was free from error, and that people who profess to believe she's a true prophet shouldn't feel at liberty to pick and choose which part of her message they would accept. Okay, let's take a quick look at one of those statements. She says, "To have my brethren who are acquainted with my mission and my work trifle with the message that God gives me to bear grieves his spirit. It is discouraging to me to have them pick out portions in the testimonies that please them, which they construe to justify their own course of action and give the impression that that portion they accept is the voice of God. And then when other testimonies come that bring rebuke upon their course, when words are spoken that do not coincide with their opinions and judgment, they dishonor God's work by saying, 'Oh, this we do not accept. It is only Sister White's opinion, and it is no better than my opinion or anyone else's.' This is dishonoring to God and grievous to his spirit." Okay, so we can see from that even though Ellen didn't claim verbal inspiration and even said her writings shouldn't be used as an authority on history, this doesn't mean it undermines the authority and authenticity of her message. Like, it doesn't imply that her message was untrustworthy, and it definitely doesn't mean that now it's okay as a Seventh-day Adventist to reject her teachings or to feel at liberty to pick and choose which part of her teachings we'll believe. What this knowledge about her inspiration and writings does call for is for us to make it a point to distinguish between her actual teachings and any incidental statements she might have made along the way. Anything she might have said that conveyed an idea she presupposed or merely held in common with other people in her day, or even something that she related from another source, just as like a necessary part in telling the story of whatever it was she was writing about. Okay. Now, regardless of the reason for an incidental statement, it's important to be aware of the fact that Ellen White did make incidental statements as just part of the natural process of human communication. She did mention things that weren't part of the message God had given her to bear. I'll give an example. Ellen White refers to the earth dozens of times in her writings as a globe. And of course, it is a globe, but the point I'm making here isn't about whether or not she was correct about that. The point I'm making is about the fact that her writings contain certain expressions that aren't actually a part of her message. Okay. In fact, she even said explicitly that the shape of the earth is not part of her message. Let's take a look at that. Here's that statement. It's found in a letter that she wrote to her son, Willie White, in 1904. And she says to him, "A man was present who had expressed a desire to see me and talk with me in regard to the round and flat world. I sent him a message that when Christ gave my commission to do the work he had placed upon me, the flat or round world was not included in the message." Okay, so that statement's super plain, right? The shape of the earth was not part of her message. And yet, you can find dozens of her writings that include her making a reference to the earth as a globe. Now, here's just one example of that. This is from her book, The Great Controversy, and she says, "For some years, the Bible has been sold without restraint in the streets of Rome, and it has now been carried to every part of the habitable globe." Now, reading the fuller context of this statement makes things even more clear, but this part is enough to actually very easily see that the point of her statement isn't about the shape of the earth. It has to do with the wide circulation of the Bible. Referring to the earth as the habitable globe is just a way for her to say the Bible has been carried to every part of the earth that's livable. Okay. Now, clearly, Ellen White did think the Earth was shaped like a globe, or else she wouldn't have referred to it that way. But that's never her main point. She's never actually teaching on the shape of the Earth in any of these statements where she uses the term globe to refer to our world. They're just statements she's made in the process of making a different point, her actual point. Again, the takeaway from this example is that there are statements in Ellen White's writings which are not an expression of her teachings, but this doesn't imply that her actual teachings are untrustworthy or that the message she bore was somehow inaccurate. It just means we should read her writings with these facts in mind and keep our claims about her writings to be in harmony with her own claims about her writings. To do otherwise would actually be to directly contradict her own testimony. Now, the rest of this letter is just basically Willie White. He starts wrapping things up with, some more niceties and that sort of thing. And then we come down here to the bottom where we see that yellow highlighted area with Ellen White's handwritten postscript where she says, "I approve of the remarks made in this letter. Signed, Ellen G. White." So everything that we just read, all the stuff about not using Ellen White's writings to settle matters regarding questions about history, the advice to go to actual historians when we want to find out some detail about chronology or some aspect of history, right? All that stuff we read about how inspiration works and how it's not on the words of the prophet, but it's on the person, him or herself. All of that is stuff that Ellen White endorsed. Okay. And if we keep these things in mind as we read her writings, or really the writings of any prophet, understanding these principles can help us to make sure we rightly understand their message. But not only that, it can guard us against making exaggerated or outrageous claims about the writings of a prophet that could really turn somebody off if they know that our claims aren't actually matching reality. Okay. And in addition to all that, it can also serve to just help protect us from falling off into some disbelief of an aspect of our message, picking and choosing what part we might be willing to believe. Or really, this principle can apply to any writing of any true prophet of God. A failure to understand these principles can and has led some people to discard the principles of the truths that God tries to teach people through the messages of his inspired prophets. So these are really important aspects to understand. Now, if you're interested in following up to study more deeply into these topics, just remember, be sure and check out the description for links. And sometimes we even throw links to extra stuff that we didn't even mention in the video. So it's always a good idea to check our description for extra information. We really do encourage people to study deeply into these things. Now, lastly, if you're appreciating the things that you're hearing on our channel and you're finding value in them, please be sure to subscribe, and also please share these videos with someone that you love. So until next time, many blessings.